we're going to start. So welcome, everyone. We're really excited to have you. This is the Green Ribbon Commission's Climate Action Exchange Program, the GRCX. My name is Azanta Thakur, and I'm the Project Manager and Administrative Coordinator for the GRC. And the GRCX, if you have never joined our program before, is our interactive virtual program series designed to support our mission of accelerating the implementation of the city's climate action plan. And we are also welcoming our Higher Ed Together audience today. So this is kind of mixing our audiences from the higher ed institutions across the city of Boston and everyone who's been engaged with the GRC in the past. So whatever institution you're coming from, welcome. We're really excited to have you today. Our program today focuses on how higher education institutions can take advantage of the resources of the Inflation Reduction Act to accelerate their climate action implementation, including partnering with community organizations, which I know is a really relevant and poignant topic right now. And so we really hope you all are able to glean some useful information from this. If at any point you have any questions, please pop them into the chat, or more preferably use the Q&A function. That way we can really keep track of the questions, and we'll be able to answer them at the end. If you don't know a little bit about the IRA, it's the largest U.S. climate investment in history, and it presents an opportunity to accelerate the climate leadership of larger institutions. It includes tax credits, financing mechanisms, and grants designed to reduce carbon emissions, promote environmental justice, and create clean energy jobs. But it's also incredibly complicated, with provisions that are difficult to interpret and funding sources that are hard to access. So this complexity can be daunting and may keep a lot of us in some institutions from accessing resources that they could otherwise use to advance their climate goals. So we hope that this makes some things a little bit more clear and easy to access. So the whole point of this GRCX is to demystify the IRA and also help institutional stakeholders access key programs of the IRA. And we're really lucky to have a panel of amazing people with us today to help demystify the aspects of the IRA. And our panelists today will be providing an overview of IRA resources and how institutions can utilize its tax credits and answer any questions that you may have. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our very first presenter. I'm going to introduce everyone, and then I'll hand it over to our first panelist. So Grace, next slide, and we can go ahead with introductions. And this is also a little into the agenda, so we will be covering each of these topics if you are curious. Next slide. Tim, I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm president of Second Nature. We're a Boston-based, actually Cambridge-based, if that matters to anybody, a nonprofit that works to accelerate climate action in and through higher education.
Great to have you. Nate,
Thanks.
Next slide. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi there, Nate Hausman. I'm with the World Resources Institute's Clean Energy team. I'm a clean energy markets manager there and have been working on a guide I'll tell you more about what we're calling an IRA roadmap that's focused on a local government audience, but is applicable to a nonprofit audience too. Thanks. Happy to be here.
Thanks for being here. Next slide. And Ian, you have the floor.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Ian, research analyst with WRI, also working with Nate on our IRA roadmap. I'll be talking today specifically about tax credits and elective pay. And also I love Boston. I was born there. I've been there many times, so really glad to be here.
None of us are biased, but we also love Boston, so glad you said that. And then next slide, Francine, you can introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Francine Newsome Pfeiffer. I'm the Vice President for Federal Relations at Rutgers University in New Jersey. So I'm your only non-Boston area presenter today. I really am bringing to this conversation my expertise in federal relations and understanding some of the nuances of the legislation and the complexities around it. So we're really bringing home the unique opportunity that the IRA presents from a university perspective.
Thank you so much. So those are our panelists for today. Next slide. And before we go ahead with Tim's part of the presentation, I just want to share a little bit more on logistics for those of you who are just joining us. So after panelist presentations, we'll have 20 to 30 minutes for Q&A at the end, which will be facilitated by Tim. And before I turn it over to him, I just want to let you all know, once again, we are recording the session. So if you need to drop off at any point, you can always catch up later. And captions are on for anyone who may need them. You can turn them on at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer, or toggle to the more option on your phone. And I will be sending out the link to the recording and the slides after the session once the recording is available. So if you have any questions, let me know. And if you can't access that, please shoot me an email, which my email will be on the screen at the very end. And if you have questions, you can always use the chat, but preferably please use the Q&A function. It just makes things a little bit more cleaner and organized, and we'll be able to pick our questions from there. And also, last thing, please mute yourselves if you are not speaking. And if you have any issues or technical difficulties, please feel free to chat me. All right, that's all from me. And Tim, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Azana. And I will say too, I just said to the panelists, we're going to pick the most interesting questions, not just the first question. So you don't have to be ambitious and get your question in first. It's going to be the ones that are the most interesting. That's the ones we want. But we do want to capture those throughout all of our presentations. So as thoughts come to you, just stick them in the Q&A and we'll be able to capture them. I'm going to provide context, and this is just going to be a quick overview, not really specific to the IRA per se, but to help us understand how the IRA in some ways came to be in thinking about how institutions like higher education, I know some of you may not be at higher education, but many of you are, why this matters to higher education. Where do we come from? Where's our history here? And how might that even shape the next round of whatever might come out of the federal government or even the state government here, and how we might think about engaging with policy based on this experience. Next slide. So one of the things our model at Second Nature, we've based this model basically in 2006. We launched a program that many of you might be familiar with. It's called the President's Climate Leadership Commitments. And the theory here is that when presidents or chancellors sign something on behalf of their institution or commit their institution to take action, it just makes those actions easier to be taken. So in 06-07, the President's Climate Leadership Commitments were launched, and this was a commitment to achieve carbon neutrality at institutions, to expose students to climate action, and to increase the amount of climate research happening in institutions. That was the commitment, and that happened early on. It was a group of 12 presidents that signed, and pretty soon it became hundreds and hundreds of institutions. Next slide. The important thing about the commitment was that it had real structure to it. It had a very clear goal, and then it had very clear timeline attached to it. So we have collected data for the past 15 years from our signatory institutions on how they've progressed, how they've done greenhouse gas inventories, how they've developed climate action plans, and really more importantly, how they've created their own institutional solutions to the goal that they set for themselves. So what's important here is to recognize that this is a sector-driven effort. It's an effort that originated within the sector and is driven internally within the sector. Next slide, please. And over the years, it's grown. Many people signed the commitment, but then not everyone has actually lasted with the commitment. Some people have not done what they said they were going to do when they committed to something. Presidents turn over. The usual annual or the lifespan of a president's around 5.5 years. So presidents don't last that long. These commitments are long-term commitment, institutional commitments. So right now we have around 450 institutions around the country that are actively pursuing this goal of carbon neutrality. And many of our institutions have had a variety of lessons along the way. And there's a pretty clear pathway whenever you start to engage in this work of how your climate action plan begins to get implemented. And many of the features that the IRA draws out actually relate to these actions that have been started already within our sector. Next slide. And the question is, like, was this program successful or not? When you compare signatory institutions that have made this particular commitment to institutions that haven't made this commitment. So this is still within the sector. You see a reduction in emissions of 47% and a reduction in energy use of 27%. So the theory actually has been borne out by the evidence, so by the actual facts on the ground. We do see more actions taking place within our sector, by those who have made this commitment, set an ambitious target, and then pursued that target. I just want to mention this as a model. So if you're in healthcare or if you're at a cultural institution, you may have a similar model, not exactly the same, but something like this, a sector-wide goal that you joined up and signed up for, that then gets implemented on your own institution, that then connects you together with other institutions that have made that same goal. And why this is important is because at the national and international scale, a lot of this voluntary action has to be the thing that drives our progress. And it connects to the IRA in that a lot of the IRA's incentive structures are really to encourage these kind of non-state, non-federal actors from taking these actions. Next slide. So let's just talk about that context. So in 2015, the Paris Agreement set this. So this is the international agreement of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. In Paris in 2015, there was a really key moment where the world basically declared that we want to keep global warming significantly below 2 degrees C. And we want to do that using a voluntary mechanism where all the countries who are parties to this agreement submit their goals, what are called the nationally determined contributions, that together will be aggregated to see if we meet this global goal of keeping things below 2 degrees. What's important about that is that each country level has to determine the NDC based on what's happening in that country. And so there are things that the federal government or the national governments do, but a lot of what they have to do to accomplish those goals relies on sectors like ours, like higher education, to create ambitious targets and then reach those goals. So this is how the nesting works at the global level. And I think we'll see at the federal level why then the IRA is like a mechanism for implementing some of this global strategy. Next slide. Since it's voluntary, stuff can happen that is not good. And I'm not going to belabor this slide because I don't want to stay on this guy for too long. But in 2017, Trump announced that he was going to withdraw the US from this global agreement. And what that did, next slide, is actually catalyze a whole movement of non-federal actors who were doing the climate work like higher education had been doing for the past 15 years. So it really was a time to see, is this subnational model something that actually has some traction? And so we brought higher education into this coalition called the We Are Still In Coalition that actually said, despite what our federal government says, we as subnational actors, this includes states, cities, businesses, higher education, healthcare, cultural institutions, religious communities, we all said we are still into this agreement. And when you looked at the scale of what that meant, if you were to add up all those non-federal actors, it reached it was about fourth on the emissions list, and GDP was roughly about the same globally. So it's this massive subnational movement that happened right in response to Trump's announcement. Next slide. And that kind of translated into this really international movement of the importance of subnational activity. The only reason I mentioned this slide is the guy that's speaking there is the guy that spoke after Mike Bloomberg, and it's Harrison Ford. Everyone came to see Harrison Ford. Sorry, Mike, but no one came to see him. So there was a lot of attention being drawn, especially at these international meetings. This is one of the COPs afterwards on the role that subnationals played in this climate work. Next slide. And so that leads us to the signing of the IRA. And I think this is like an appropriate slide because Manchin, senator from West Virginia, had a huge hand in shaping what the legislation looked like. But I would argue it was built, the foundation of what especially federal legislation is built upon is recognizing that there are actions that are already taking place in society. What we're asking people to do is not so radical that it couldn't be done. And in fact, it's building upon that and incentivizing those actors to do more. So what we could think of is our actions are part of something that's larger and it's connected to this IRA. The IRA isn't the only thing that starts everything. This is built on decades and decades of action that we've all taken together. Next slide. And when you look at what the IRA actually does relative to what was going to happen otherwise, it is substantial and significant. I'm sure the other panelists will get into this more, But the idea that we would have tried to reach our nationally determined contribution without something like the IRA was really, we would have been kidding ourselves. Even the substantial movement in the subnational area, we were getting, between 30 and 40% reductions, even just at the state, local, and institutional level. We never would have reached our goal, like this NDC goal, which is, essentially 50% by 2030 and eliminating emissions by 2050. Next slide. So how we think about that is, for higher education, there are different categories of activity that we can take to accelerate action. Not all of them are operation decarbonization. Some of them involve different knowledge assets, for example, that we have. The research that is done at our institutions can be an accelerant for climate action. And the IRA actually incentivizes those types of research activities. So just click one more time on this. So what these stars are actually showing, the stars, yeah, okay. The stars show that in each of these categories, whether you're thinking about higher education as a research enterprise, as an anchor institution in your communities, as an educational delivery mechanism, as a form of advocacy, as a way to mobilize finance and investments, administrative leadership commitments to something, or just operations. In all of these categories, the IRA actually does touch on them to some extent. The ones that are the stars that are clear, they touch a little bit less on those areas, but they do touch on slightly on educational opportunities for example, for workforce development. Most of these other categories are very explicitly a part of the IRA's incentive structure. So that's the context that I wanted to start us off with, is just to say our work within the sector is based on decades of experience and activity. And what the federal government does, and in this case did with the IRA, is create poured, I don't know what the equivalent of rocket fuel would be that's renewable, but plugged us into a lot of more opportunities to access resources across these different categories of assets that we have as higher education institutions. And from this point on, we want to just dig into the mechanics of what that looks like at the IRA. And to do that, to start off, I'm going to turn it over to Nate at WRI.
Thanks so much, Tim. Can you hear me okay? Great. Okay. Well, that was great context, and really appreciate you sort of setting the stage. As I already said, Nate Hausman, I'm a clean energy markets manager at WRI, or World Resources Institute. We are, for anyone who may not know, we're a global nonprofit. We research, design, and carry out solutions for both people and planet. And our U.S. energy program focuses on addressing market barriers and accelerating the transition to renewable energy resources. So today's webinar fits neatly within that frame of accelerating the transition to renewables. And we're honored to have the opportunity to be with you today. I'm here with Ian, who already introduced himself. So next slide, please. Yeah, so first let me give you a run through of what Ian and I will cover today. I'll talk a little bit about the IRA, and I know we've mentioned sort of the scope of the opportunity, but I'll just underscore that point, put an exclamation point on it. Then I'll briefly cover some of the funding opportunities, the grant and loan opportunities, including the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Then I'll turn it over to Ian, who's the real expert here, to talk about some of the juicy stuff, namely IRA tax credit opportunities and how they can be realized through elective pay for nonprofit institutions and public entities. And we'll wrap with a summary slide and some links to some resources that might be helpful to you. Next. So yeah, our interest, just again for context, our team's work on this topic has been supported by Bloomberg Philanthropies and the Local Infrastructure Hub, a national program that's designed to connect cities and towns with expert advice and resources to access federal funding opportunities and to drive local progress and improve communities. So towards that end, we're developing a guidebook that's going to be titled Catalyzing Local Clean Energy, a roadmap for maximizing IRA opportunities and community benefits. We plan to publish it soon, by the end of this month, hopefully. It's geared toward, as the title suggests, it's geared toward an audience of local governments, but it'll be broadly applicable to public and tax exempt nonprofit institutions too. Next. Yeah, so this onto the IRA and the scope of the opportunity. So as Tim mentioned, 13 months ago this week, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law, and that, of course, signaled the largest federal climate investment in the history of the U.S. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated that the climate and energy spending somewhere in the ballpark of $391 billion, but we've seen estimates from places like Goldman Sachs that far exceed that on the score of 1.22 trillion. Next. So what accounts for this wide variability in these estimates? Well, partly it's because so much of the incentives provided in the IRA come in the form of tax credits, which are largely uncapped and can be leveraged throughout the next decade. In fact, some 70% of the IRA's climate and energy spending operates as tax credits. And the remaining 30% is sort of complementary tools. That's what I'm going to touch on in just a second, designed to help communities, states, tribes, nonprofits implement clean energy projects, including grants and programs really geared toward low income and historically underserved communities. So the clean energy tax credits, the yellow slices on this figure alone, account for some 40% of the legislation's climate and energy spending. And again, just because the tax credits are uncapped, really the sky's the limit, and the opportunity sits with all of us. Next. So the IRA it not only expands the sort of scope and the timeline of these clean energy tax credits, but it also expands access to them. It changes the tax code to enable elective pay, and Ian's going to cover this in more detail. But that means that for the first time, public and nonprofit organizations can receive cash refunds for the value of tax credits for qualifying clean energy projects that they own and place in service. So it really changes the landscape from one that had to involve tax equity investors and complicated structures to one where entities like you all in the audience can own assets directly. And of course, these clean energy projects can help you. It can help you meet your decarbonization goals. They can also advance local economic development, energy security, environmental justice, public health, resilience, equity, and there's lots of supports to sort of support those goals as well embedded in the IRA. Next. Yeah, so there are the big buckets of funding that public and nonprofit institutions can tap into in the form of, comes in the form of sort of grants and loans, and also in the form of tax credits. I'm going to cover the grants and loans piece here at the top, but let me just emphasize that what's here isn't a complete list. It's not exhaustive. It's just intended to give you a sense of what's out there, and it's a smattering. And I'm going to run through it pretty fast so we can turn it over to Ian. Next. So among the grant programs are the U.S. Department of Energy's Renew America's Nonprofit program that for energy projects in buildings owned and operated by nonprofits. That's one opportunity. There's the EPA's Environmental Justice Thriving Communities grant-making program that selects 5 to 11 entities to provide grant funds to community-based nonprofit organizations. So you'll see some of this sort of as pass-through funds to other organizations too, or to support things, and that's sort of a theme throughout as well. There's EPA's pollution prevention grants. There's also EPA's Brownfields program, which is an existing program, but that received additional funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law that predated the IRA. But this is a particularly important one that I'll underscore because there's an energy communities bonus that you'll hear more about in the tax credit categories, and brownfields are an eligible category of energy communities. Next. Yeah, so it's not just about DOE or the EPA. The Department of Agriculture also administers loan and grant programs for utilities and energy project developers. So these including the Empowering Rural America funding, There's also climate pollution reduction planning and implementation grants that were introduced in the IRA, and those are available to states, tribes, municipalities, air pollution control agencies. And then WRI has been working on electric school bus program, and EPA has grants focused on this through the bipartisan infrastructure law that offers $5 billion in grant competition for zero and low emission school buses. The Department of Transportation also has funding opportunities around EVs. So there's a lot sort of out there. And as I said, this is just sort of a smattering of things that I think might be interesting to this audience. Next. Yeah, and actually, you can just go on to the next slide too. One of the big opportunities, of course, is through that the IRA passed into law the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund that allocates $27 billion that's designed to mobilize public and private investment in clean energy. And it's really focused on 3 different programs, but it's sort of designed to bring public capital to drive private investment. So there's a $14 billion National Clean Investment Fund to provide grants to just a few nonprofits for clean energy financing, to partner with business to sort of juice the wheels for grease the skids for further investment. So again, that's sort of like, one of these things that where big pot of money to a select few, but then hopefully gets distributed much more broadly. There's $6 billion Clean Communities Investment Accelerator. Again, 2 to 7 nonprofits get funding through this. And there's a $7 billion Solar for All competition that awards up to 60 grants to states, territories, tribes, municipalities, and eligible nonprofits to sort of expand the number of low and disadvantaged communities primes that's focused mostly on solar and associated solar and storage technology. Next. So let me, I'll just say that funding received through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and some of these other grant opportunities may be able to provide upfront financing for projects, and that can partially be reimbursed through elective pay and other tax incentives. And so that's a good segue. And I will pass the mic over to Ian. Ian, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Nate, and thank you for going over all those opportunities. We're going to start talking about tax credits and elective pay, which I think many folks in higher ed, in the nonprofit sector, public sector, may not have really thought about before, thought that they could access. So if we can go to the next slide. So I want to start off by, talking about how the IRA really, the volume of tax credits, the volume of spending cannot be overstated. It is huge. It covers a whole bunch and a half of different areas, from clean electricity to nuclear power to carbon sequestration to clean vehicles to energy efficient commercial buildings. As Nate said, 70%, a very clear majority of the spending in the IRA for climate and clean energy comes in the forms of these tax credits. And so that's why in our work and in forums like this, one of the things that we want to emphasize is that even though entities, public entities, higher ed, nonprofit may not have thought about using tax credits before because they don't pay taxes, right? Need to really think about these opportunities, particularly in light of elective pay. And so again, just emphasizing the scope and emphasizing the breadth of this. So, but even though there's a lot of different tax credits, there's only some that are probably going to be really most relevant for, for higher ed, for nonprofit folks. If you are doing a micronuclear plant, all the power to you. But where we want to start is with the investment and production tax credits. So if we could go to the next slide. Okay. This slide was supposed to come earlier, but never mind. Again, just emphasizing the 70%, that 70%, that there's a lot of this funding in the form of tax credits. So next slide. Great. So the really kind of key cornerstones of the tax credit program in the IRA are the ITC and PTC, investment tax credit and production tax credit. These are long-standing energy tax credits that work to incentivize clean, renewable energy development. They've been around for decades and have been really key to the development of solar and wind in particular. And they're based on different things. Production tax credit is based on actual production from a renewable energy source, whereas investment tax credit is based on the actual money invested. It's based on eligible costs. ITC has generally been available for solar, whereas production tax credit is mostly associated with the wind industry. But the IRA took these existing tax credits and made a lot of really important changes to them that make them even more substantial and more interesting, particularly for public and nonprofit sector folks. So if we could go to the next slide. Some of the biggest changes are the extension and certainty of these tax credits. These tax credits have been subject to multiple cycles of renewal and phase out, but the IRA extended these tax credits very firmly to either 2032 or when the U.S. hits 25% of its 2022 emissions from the electricity sector. Basically, the IRA made these tax credits certain and stable for a very long time frame in terms of tax credits. The ITC and PTC were expanded to include different technologies. In fact, in 2025, we're going to be eligible respectively for any net zero clean electricity source, which means that solar and wind, as well as resources like geothermal or even hydroelectric, are going to have more options for how to monetize and how to get benefits. The IRA also introduced a base and bonus credit structure, which I'll kind of go into a little bit. Basically, the ITC and PTC start at a base, but include extra incentives for various different qualifications, including domestic manufacturing, using domestically manufactured tools, being cited in energy communities or in low-income communities or benefiting low-income communities. And then finally, the IRA introduced two new mechanisms for monetization called elective pay and transferability. We'll go into elective pay. I'm sure many of you have heard about this and are thinking about how this might impact you. But it's also important to note that the IRA introduced transferability, which is a method for taxpayers to sell their tax credits to other folks. Direct pay eligible entities cannot actually engage in transferability, but it is something that might come up, and there may be possibilities in the future, although that's still dependent on some guidance. So I know I just introduced a lot at you, and this is a lot of information. These slides are going to be sent out afterwards, but again, I would keep wanting to emphasize the scale and scope of these changes. The IRA did a lot, and did a lot to not just add money to the equation, but expand the possibilities of what's possible through changes like this. If we can go to the next slide. And so illustrating kind of some of the potential here, I pulled this graphic from Evergreen Action, showing kind of, why it's important we think about ITC and PTC. As you can see, if you go to the figure on the left, if you add together the base credit as well as all of the potential bonuses that a project might have, you could see up to 70% of the eligible costs of a project covered under a tax credit. That's incredible. The production tax credit also has a similar base and bonus structure, and it goes up to 3.35 cents per kilowatt hour, which doesn't sound a lot, but makes a big difference at like large energy scales. So this illustration really shows that and shows why I'm focusing on these credits, because it's potentially a massive boost and massive increase in savings for these types of projects, and can, with these savings, can lead to more ambition, lead to bigger projects, lead to projects that use maybe different technologies that are innovative. I know that a lot of higher ed folks in particular are interested in exploring some of these new ways of doing things to show what's possible. And ITC and PTC, in combination with elective pay, might be able to make some of this happen. And so next slide. And so I have a couple slides here just talking about what the bonuses are. I won't go into too much detail because there's a lot of rules about this, but there's a domestic content bonus that is related to using domestically manufactured materials. This bonus, as well as the energy community bonus, is equal to either 10 percentage points added to the ITC or a 10% increase to the PTC. Again, really large bonuses. There is a interesting development with elective pay. I will mention this later, but there is some rules about how domestic content and using domestic content for elective pay projects. Next slide. There's also the energy community bonus credit. This one I would recommend folks watch out for, because there are a lot of communities, as you might see on the map, that are designated as energy communities under the qualifications, some of which may not be historically or popularly associated with fossil fuel production. It has to do with whether there's coal plants that were closed in the area, or how much fossil fuel employment and unemployment is in your area. And so we can actually, there was a map that was released by DOE showing all the energy communities. Again, and this shows like there is a lot of potential for getting even more savings than just the regular ITC and PTC. And then next slide. And then finally, as going through the last of the bonuses, we have the Low Income Communities Bonus Credit Program, really interesting program that kind of functions like a grant on top of a tax credit, and can lead to big savings for smaller projects that benefit or are located in low-income communities or Native American communities, and can add to the savings and add to the benefit and ambition of a lot of smaller projects. And so next slide. So I just went through the ITC and PTC. There was a lot to cover in there, and it's okay if you don't remember it all. Slides are going to be sent out. It's a lot. But I do want to also point out there are other tax credits. The IRA introduced and updated a lot of them. And so for higher ed, for public and nonprofit entities, these are some of the ones that we think are going to be the most relevant. So we have the 45W, which is the Commercial Qualified Clean Vehicles Credit. It applies to any private company, nonprofit, or government through elective pay. And it's up to $7,500 for smaller vehicles and $40,000 for vehicles over 14,000 pounds, excuse me. And I'll talk a little bit about how this might interact with elective pay. But this is probably a really useful one, as with procurement, with managing fleets, that folks may actually be wanting to get their feet wet in like soon, particularly with their clean vehicle, battery electric vehicle procurement. Additionally, there's also the alternative fuel refueling property credit. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but what it does is it applies to fueling equipment for clean fuels, including electricity, installed in certain census tracts, particularly non-urban and or low-income census tracts. So you may have been familiar with this credit. It's existed for private companies for a while, but it is also eligible for elective pay, and is worth a substantial amount if prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements are met. And so this may apply to your situation depending on where exactly you were located and the demographics as well as situation of your community. And then finally, we have the energy efficient commercial buildings deduction. This allows for a tax deduction for energy savings produced by qualifying building upgrades. The IRA actually increased this credit amount as well as opened eligibility for nonprofits. Previously, only government buildings were the only tax-exempt entities able to actually use this, but now nonprofit buildings, including higher ed, are able to take this deduction for energy-efficient upgrades to their buildings and can work with designers to actually use this deduction. So next slide. Great. So we just kind of went through elective, all of the possible tax credits that you can use. And there's a lot. There's more that I didn't cover that may be applicable to your specific scenario, that to your, a project that you're potentially working on. But now I want to go into elective pay, which has been a hot topic for a while. It's new, it's innovative. It really is a new pathway for tax-exempt entities like higher education to access these savings for their projects in a way that they really could not before. Next slide. So what is elective pay? If you haven't heard of it or haven't heard exactly what it is, elective pay is a means for delivering 12 IRA tax credits to tax-exempt entities, makes them available as direct cash refunds, and they're available for state, local, territorial, and tribal governments, as well as agencies and instrumentalities, and 501c3 nonprofit organizations. Basically, any 501c3 any tax-exempt organizations. Looks like I am running out of time a little bit, so if I could go to the next slide. You can skip forward. Next slide. This is highlighting that there are only some tax credits that are going to be really most relevant for most entities, including the investment and production tax credits, as well as the commercial clean vehicle credit. Next slide. And just kind of thinking about what elective pay does, it really expands the realm of what technologies are accessible and affordable to implement. It incentivizes the direct ownership of eligible infrastructure and disrupts many of the aspects of traditional public and nonprofit sector energy financing. And it also gives nonprofit actors and public actors greater options and leverages in procurement. And transition to the next slide. One of the key themes I want to highlight is that elective pay requires direct ownership to claim. So many traditional procurement structures for renewable energy, for energy efficiency upgrades, for nonprofits and government rely on third-party ownership. But elective pay is going to require public and nonprofit entities to finance upfront or work out some sort of ownership deal, which may expose public and nonprofit operators to some extra risk. Next slide. And next slide. But it really expands the possibilities. A lot of existing financing mechanisms, particularly at the building level, have been focused on energy efficiency. And so what we see here with elective pay is that we really see an expansion of what's possible to distributed energy resources, to EVs and charging equipment, as I was kind of mentioning earlier, were some of the most important ones. So we can see an expansion of institutional climate ambition. And if we could go to the next slide. Yep, exactly what I was saying. Makes these technologies more affordable for the mush market, for if you're familiar with that term. Next slide. And I think I don't want to keep folks too long. There's a lot to cover with this. So I think I might cut it off here. If we could actually go to the summary slide. If you could go through, scroll through, there's a lot of different types of projects that folks can use with elective pay. And next slide. And I also would want to mention that with elective pay, there's a really good opportunity, as Nate was talking about earlier, with grants. Elective pay can work really well with grants. Tax-exempt grants and forgivable loans do not affect the amount of payment an entity receives through elective pay, which means you can really have this interesting opportunity for getting grants and loans for upfront funding and look for ways to stack some of these grants with elective pay and achieve a lot of savings. It's important to consider if grant programs allow this, but from the elective pay from the tax credit side, they do actually allow this. And so there's really interesting synergizing opportunities there. And next slide. So so kind of summarizing and looking to our whole thing, the scale, we want to emphasize that the scale of the opportunity afforded by the IRA is massive. It's more than enough than we can cover maybe in the time we were allotted. That's how big this is, and how excited we are to talk about this work. It introduced a lot of grant programs, introduced and strengthened many of the climate and clean energy tax credits that we've seen, and made them accessible to the nonprofit and public sectors. And so what we can see here is there's just a huge opportunity for increased ambition. There's a lot of different directions that public and nonprofit entities can go in using these tax credits, using these grants to make their climate action even stronger than it was before. And so we really encourage you to think about this holistically. And next slide. Look to some of these resources, which we've outlined. There's a lot here, and you'll be able to see these afterwards. But I just want to re-up again that we are releasing a roadmap later this month for thinking about maximizing IRA opportunities and community benefits. And while we focus a lot on local governments in that paper, but all of the lessons about things like elective pay and tax credits are really applicable to any public sector and potentially any nonprofit organization as well. So please, I encourage you to really think ambitiously about this and take these opportunities and go forward with them. And with that, that's a great transition into our presentation from Francine and thinking about specifically the IRA in the institutional context.
Thank you, Ian. That was great. I really appreciate how much groundwork you and Nate have laid to really understand just how broad these and massive these opportunities are. So as I mentioned, I'm the Vice President for Federal Relations at Rutgers. Next slide. If you're wondering why a university lobbyist is on this panel, I think it really speaks to the uniqueness of the Inflation Reduction Act and the variety of opportunities. And this is such a big and important piece of legislation that opportunities, here we are over a year out, and they're continuing to unfold. So it requires people like me to help my colleagues on campus understand where we can play a role. And since this is a place-based discussion, and these are place-based investments, I thought I would start with just a slide to show you. On the bottom right, that's where my office is, a few steps away from the Capitol in Washington, D.C. Today, I have the pleasure of being on campus in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and it's a really large institution. And so the complexity of the IRA mapped with the complexity of our institution is no small feat when thinking about how do we go about pursuing opportunities. So we can go to the next slide. Just want to tell you a little bit more about Rutgers. So we are the oldest, largest, and most diverse public university in the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area. We are a land grant. So teaching, research, and public service are all a key part of our mission. with more than 67,000 students across our 3 physical campuses in New Brunswick, Newark, and Camden. And then, of course, we have research sites all over the state. And I think, importantly, our footprint is huge. I don't know how our facilities folks manage 30 million square feet and 900 buildings and 6,000 acres, along with our 19,000 residence hall beds, but they do. So you can imagine they're really interested to know how they can make financing some of these things more efficient and help reach our net zero carbon emissions by 2040. So getting into it, what have we been doing at Rutgers to try and get our heads around this and really thinking about our role? Next slide. What we first stumbled on how complicated some of this newer federal legislation would be in trying to unpack the bipartisan infrastructure law that also goes by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And that was passed in 2021. And again, just like the IRA, very big, some new things, some not so new things that have been expanded, and more questions than answers when it came to what role universities could play. So if this is something you haven't spent a lot of time with and are these opportunities continue to roll out year to year, so it's not too late. Build.gov provides you a really good place to start with a very informative guidebook. However, even after reading that entire guidebook and going through it with our facilities folks and our government relations team, as well as our climate action colleagues, we still had a lot of questions, and we were frustrated to find that many of the opportunities that were described were really not designed with universities in mind. Now, you can ask, well, you're a university lobbyist, why didn't you fix that problem before it started? Why was there not more focus? And I'll be honest, offices like mine are often 2, 3, 4 people, if we're lucky, in DC, and we're advocating for research, for student aid, for all manner of policies affecting how we do research and deliver education. And so the environmental legislation that affects infrastructure and the environment is a really small part of our work. And so we're playing catch up, just like most of us are most of the time with our very demanding work. So unfortunately, it was the case that universities were really not the focus. The good news was trying to understand the law and everything in it really brought together a collaborative set of partners on campus that I think is absolutely essential as we move into looking at what's available in the Inflation Reduction Act. And so at Rutgers, that meant our federal and state government affairs partners, our institutional planning and operations facilities partners, our University Climate Action Office, and while not mentioned on the slide, our research office as well. Really connecting all of us to understand where are the real opportunities, what are our goals at Rutgers, and how do we begin to peel back the onion and understanding the details of some of the opportunities out there. Now, it was mentioned in the last set of slides about the Clean School Bus program. That was definitely something. Rutgers has the 2nd largest bus fleet in the state of New Jersey to New Jersey Transit. And so that school bus program was of great interest to us until we found out that it is indeed not available to universities. So they've now made some of the awards in that program, and they have a tremendous backlog just of K-12 institutions. So it is clearly the case that there is far more demand for that particular program than there is funding available. The good news is the Inflation Reduction Act really does fill that gap. So moving on to the next slide. So I can't drive home enough the points that have already been made about just how attractive the elective pay tax credits are, in particular in the Inflation Reduction Act. If you are confused and feel like, wow, there's so much I don't know about this legislation, you're absolutely not alone. It's hundreds of pages long. And with so many new programs, guidance continues to roll out. And we've been waiting a while. We were delighted this summer to see some of the preliminary IRS guidance on how elective pay will work. So I have a live link here that when these are shared, hopefully you can take a look and keep track. There are still quite a few of the programs where the guidance is not yet out. So I'll talk about what we do know so far. And so the pre-filing registration requirement is something I want to drive home. It is really important that you learn who your tax manager is on campus or at your institution. Whoever is filing your taxes, and if you're thinking universities or nonprofits, we don't file taxes, but we actually do. We file 1099s. And if you have unrelated business income, so at Rutgers, we have a bookstore, we rent out our facilities. So we generated what is called UBIT. So we've been filing taxes year after year. The tax credits become part of that process. You're filing for these tax credits as part of your annual 1099, and it will be funded as a refund after any taxes might be due. So the other important thing to know, that pre-filing registration is absolutely required. The form is not out yet, but it will be posted on the IRS website sometime this fall. So I think making plans now makes a tremendous amount of sense, but you can't actually start filing the paperwork yet. But be sure that you've connected with whoever is filing the taxes for your institution to initiate that process when the time is right. You will not be able to just file a 1099 and ask for that tax credit if you have not followed the pre-filing registration requirement. The other thing that I want to point out is that we've noticed at Rutgers that while really exciting, the elective pay, and I think for us, EV is one of the more obvious targets, it really presents a lot of complications for university business and accounting. So to understand how your institutional budget processes would take into account that retroactive refund, and how making sure that the path is clear for how to bring some of that savings back to probably the department responsible for making those investments, so that they can also be used to manage the new technologies, is important. At Rutgers, we have a large solar array. We have quite a few charging stations, and many of those have been public-private partnerships. So the idea that these would be investments we would make on our own, I completely agree with the comment that it does present new risks for our institution, and we're working through that now to understand sort of the cost benefit on whether or not we want to make those investments on our own. I mean, personally, it seems like a no-brainer, but I'm not the one who has to manage our charging stations if one of them goes down. So next slide, please. The tax incentives, as I said, are probably among the most obvious. We've just heard about them. What I want to emphasize is that these are guaranteed if you check all the boxes for the requirements. So again, the IRS guidance is going to be absolutely critical to follow. There are requirements on types of vehicles that are eligible. And so making sure you check all the boxes means you get the $7,500 credit or the $40,000 credit with no limit. There's absolutely no limit per institution, and there's no national limit. I think that's the thing I want to emphasize most strongly, is that the sky is truly the limit. There is what I fear on the political side of the house, since that's what I spend my time on, is if power changes in Washington, you could imagine a scenario where people try to dial things back if this suddenly costs so much more than anyone estimated. And I do think it really is an open question how much these credits are going to cost. And so I'm always the optimist and say, well, don't worry, you have time. We have about 10 years to take advantage of these credits. I would act expeditiously to get my ducks in a row and plan to pursue these credits if you're interested, and not wait. I just think that the politics of the current environment in Washington are so terribly unpredictable that I would not let this incredible once-in-a-generation opportunity pass me by. Now, one of the things I want to emphasize, as I had talked about the partnerships on campus that I think are really essential to pursuing these opportunities, I also think it's really important to partner with local counterparts, MPOs. There are so many overlapping pieces of legislation and considerations, and frankly, investments at the state and local level that you wouldn't want to operate in a vacuum. I think that would be short-sighted, and you could actually leave money on the table. An example I provide on the final bullet here is that New Jersey offers a plug-and-play EV infrastructure grant. That grant requires you to file the application before you buy any equipment, which is the exact opposite of the federal tax credit, which requires everything to be operational, installed and operational before you file the tax credit. So I think the devil is really in the details with all of these programs, and it does take time and it takes really patience to make sure you're meeting with all the right people to really not leave any opportunity, undiscovered. So moving to the next slide. So moving from the tax credit, I wanted to give an example on the grant side of the house. Another new program that wasn't mentioned in the previous slides are community change grants. These are grants from the EPA. It's a $2 billion program, and the NOFO, the funding opportunity announcement, has not come out yet. And it's expected this autumn. And so I put in a link here so you could follow it on their website. I really like to flag brand new programs like this, because this is a huge amount of funding that the EPA is administering. It means that they are going to be looking to new partners. They can't just go back to the same already previously EPA funded partners to get all of this money out the door. So I think it's really, I always find that new programs are worth considering because they really often provide a really fresh look and new approach, especially if it's an agency you haven't worked with before. So I wanted to flag this particular opportunity. You can imagine, given how much funding the EPA has received in the IRA, it's taking them some time to get these, especially the new programs together and those funding announcements out the door. So again, if you have just started considering these things, you are not too late. At Rutgers, we have a New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center. So really functions as part of our land grant mission, where we are providing these kinds of supports across the state in different communities. And that is partially state funded. So looking to the federal government for additional funding is particularly attractive. Moving on to the next slide. I want to drive home just how historic the level of investment is. Credit to the Rocky Mountain Institute for this particular slide, but you can see that the final column is the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, as compared to funding over previous decades for these kinds of environmental and research investments. So I just cannot say, I don't think if you haven't gotten the message that this is unique and the time to act is now, I hope this slide really drives that point home. And then I want to leave with just a few key takeaways before we get to the Q&A. So next slide, please. Talked about how big of an opportunity is. We've talked about how collaboration is essential. That collaboration should not just be internal. Ideally, it's also external. If you don't have a committee looking at these things and you think your office all by itself is going to pursue these opportunities, whatever office that may be, I think that's probably a mistake. You really want to understand what's already happening on the ground, not just at your institution, but around you, to make sure you're plugging in thoughtfully and playing as big a role as you can. It's really, I think, incumbent upon institutions like ours to be a good citizen and to take advantage of these opportunities and to demonstrate leadership. I increasingly worry, as an advocate for higher education who's been doing this for 20 plus years, that universities are increasingly seen as self-serving and elitist, and we have a real responsibility to serve the community and to serve and to really assist partners who might not be as well resourced as us. So I'm saying that from an institution that feels like it is not well resourced, given our size and scope. But I'm proud that we still take the time to really work closely with stakeholders across the state to try and leverage all of our resources together and move forward. I'd also say that it's important to tell our stories. So you all you're here, you're already thinking about this work. And I believe that we need to get the message out. I don't ever want to see higher ed left out of major pieces of legislation. So while we are included in the IRA through virtue of these large programs, there was a moment where we weren't even sure if public universities were eligible for some of the elective, also called direct pay tax credits, because some of us are instrumentalities of the state. And thankfully, the guidance from the IRS made that really clear. But it kind of was just another example of how institutions of higher education are often overlooked in this conversation. And between our actual physical investments in our physical plant to our research, our service, and our workforce development, we should be at the front of the conversation, not at the back. And we need help to tell stories to key stakeholders. So I hope if you have government affairs partners, communications partners at your institution, that you'll consider keeping them up to date about how you're thinking about the IRA. One of the ways we can stave off any attempts at curtailing current or future investments is to make sure that we make it so obvious how important and how useful this funding is that it would be politically unwise to act in any other way. And then lastly, just keep in mind the last hyperlink I have on this slide is the guidance that has yet to be, the guidance has not been issued. So for all the elective pay tax credits, there is a direct link to elective pay, some really helpful FAQs about how that works, and then also gets into the details of some of the specific programs. Those details, like I said, are not all out yet. So if you're looking at these, continue to refresh that website for more details in the coming months. And with that, I think that's the end of my slides.
Great. Thanks, Francine. That was awesome. And thanks, Nate and Ian. Great context. And we're going to jump right into questions. The way we bucketed, and thanks for all the questions that have been put in the Q&A so far and then in the chat. We're going to kind of try to bucket things, to categorize things, and then address them as kind of more categories. So hopefully your specific question will be captured in these buckets. And the first area I want to cover was this idea of kind of the political implication for the timeline. It seems like there's concern, and Francine, you even mentioned this, like act now because we don't know what's going to happen. And the question I think really is though, like what levers do elected officials have to just like, no one's going to repeal the IRA, but there are things they can do. Like you mentioned, you put limits, you put caps, you put time, you put expiration dates. Could you speak a little bit to those levers that they might have that we would be concerned about with a changed either, executive branch or different interests in Congress that might take some actions?
Yeah, and this came up a little bit earlier this year with their budget deficit talks. So coming to agreement on how to fund our overall federal budget. The question of whether or not any of these programs would be in their sights, it was a real question. I didn't think it was real politically, but the fact that it was even mentioned suggests that is something we should be paying attention to and not taking for granted. The reconciliation, these efforts to kind of hem in federal spending, a technical corrections bill, it would frankly would require Republicans to have at least one more branch of the government, really probably all three, to realistically get those through. But I have learned not to count any possibility out in this environment. And that's why I don't think it's like a next year problem, or probably not even a 2 years from now problem. But I just wouldn't I wouldn't just sit and wait to see that happen.
Right. So we've heard, other folks who helped design this legislation intentionally had pieces of it all across, various agencies, different types of funding mechanisms. So it's not just a single switch you flip on or off.
Exactly.
So there's a bit of durability attached to it.
Exactly.
Nate or Ian, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I'll just briefly weigh in, and Ian probably has more context, but I have heard that, there are ways that states may try and preclude. I mean, I know there's a handful, just a few states, for instance, that didn't apply for greenhouse gas reduction funds at the state level. I know there's also initiatives like sort of anti-ESG movements and motivations that seem like they could clamp down on some of these funding sources. So, I do think, there could be ways that, interceding events could bring some challenges to delivery. That said, I also think, particularly, when it comes to the, elective pay and tax credits, I do think because everybody wants to see these projects go to their communities, I think those are much safer. So, Ian, you can probably provide more context too.
Yeah, I think you hit it well, Nate. I'm not a political prognosticator myself, and I'm not gonna, pretend to be, but it is true that things like direct pay, these tax credits, grants are benefiting communities now, right? And we're seeing these benefits flow to a lot of folks, and including many of these benefits flowing to traditionally more conservative areas, more conservative states that we may think are opposed to these types of things. But there's a lot of investment flowing everywhere. And so, I think it's important to recognize that while you're thinking, and not necessarily be scared off from taking advantage of this by by that threat, because it's not maybe as large as it might think. There's also, I do want to also point out, and something that I didn't get to mention, there is incentive for folks to take advantage of elective pay for clean energy right now, because there are domestic content rules, which will decrease the amount of tax credit you receive if you do not meet certain domestic content requirements. So I encourage folks, so for people thinking about energy installations and using elective pay for that, that's something people really should get a jump on, not for political reason, but for statutory reasons.
Got it. Let's talk about funding flows a little bit, because there's a number of questions about this. It seems like some of the IRA provisions direct large amounts of funding either to a state agency, or to a large intermediary that then redistributes those funds out. Can you speak to the challenges and opportunities associated with these kind of that funding flow model? You know, is most of it, you really have to pay attention at the state level because the state's the one receiving all this, you know, these chunks, or like I know we, Second Nature, applied for the Renew America's Nonprofits grant program, representing a bunch of institutions. We had hundreds of institutions as part of our portfolio. So like, we know that some of those are time sensitive, but the flows go to an intermediary rather than directly to a single institution. Can you maybe speak to that? Maybe Francine, start with a New Jersey example.
Well, I don't know that I have a specific example to point to. It's more that this is why you absolutely have to have a committee approach and a collaborative approach. We will be tripping all over each other, and perhaps angering what should be our partners if we don't do that. And so that's why for us, like federal, really, I'm in Washington, but regular meetings with my state counterparts about what they're seeing. We brought in a consultant. I'll be honest, it won't be our last. It definitely, the complexity of some of these things when you're talking about really big investments means having that sort of CYA function of an outside consultant has been helpful. And so it does really require an all hands on deck approach.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I mean, I think it's sort of all the above, because there's programs that, you know, it's true that many of these programs do provide grants to sort of intermediaries to in turn distribute funds, and that is a number of programs, and so you really do have to pay attention. I know the EPA in particular for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund has had some partnering forms and opportunities where you can sort of fill out and say, hey, I'm interested in partnering, and so there have been some opportunities there. I think some of those may have even closed already. So, you know, the opportunity is now for sure. But I do think the collaborative approach is really, really important.
Yep, that was the same way. There's a teaming list that the DOE puts together, so it's a similar thing, and you see who wants to apply for different parts of these grants. And this may be too technical, so I'm not sure we'll get it, but in Massachusetts, I'm just going to read the question. Some of the Massachusetts state rebate programs are now requiring projects to pursue federal tax credits, and that funding will be presumably deducted from the state rebate amounts. And the questioner is saying this is bad. How can we prevent this from happening? I think let's leave that latter part aside, but the beginning part, do you know the relationship between the deduction, and maybe Ian, this might be a question for you about, like, if you take a state tax advantage, do you lose, or can you double count, or how, anything there?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I do want to bring up that there's going to be a lot of these edge cases that come up, and so I think it's going to be important for folks, as kind of Francine, we're talking about this collaborative approach, bringing in your tax advisors, your legal team, like, to get some of these opinions is going to be key. Just kind of generally, what we know is that for elective pay in particular, the grants, federal grants, and forgivable loans do not reduce the tax exempt, do not reduce the amount of tax received. That likely includes state grants, although I am not sure for certain. But at least on the federal elective pay side, what seems to be coming out is that they want folks to be able to use grants, at least from the federal grants, in combination with elective pay. And so they probably wouldn't have the reduction on the elective pay side. However, individual programs, grants, state programs, rebates, what have you, every one of those is going to have to figure out how they deal with elective pay. Some of them may decide to lower the amount that they have in anticipation of elective pay. And that's unfortunately not a decision IRS can control, really.
If I could just double down on that, Tim, states are going to do what they think is going to help them meet their bottom line. And I'm not surprised, I'm disappointed, but not surprised to hear that that's the approach in Massachusetts. It frankly follows how federal funding for student aid works. Pell Grants are first dollar, like the states would prefer the feds come up with their money first. And so Pell Grants are first dollar funding, and state funding kind of rolls in around it, as well as institutional aid. So there's sort of a model for it. I can't really blast them too much for that decision.
Right.
Yeah, my background's in state level solar policy, and just even before the passage of the IRA, there was a trend sort of downward towards reducing incentives, particularly for those leading states out there like Massachusetts. So I can't speak to the nuances, but again, not necessarily a surprise, because I think that trend was in place even before the IRA passed. But certainly states are going to respond to federal policy.
So just as a theme on this funding flows, each situation is probably going to be a little bit different depending on where you are. Talk to your team members. And if you don't have a team, you got to put it together with the right types of people. Francine's experience would speak to that. And then you can move forward based on that, specifics of your project within whatever the context is. I think there is a role, like a valid role, for advocating, as Francine, you mentioned, like even getting clarity from Treasury on through instrumentalities of the state. Actually, are they eligible here? And then getting that clarification. That happens at the agency level. Agencies do provide clarification for things. And that's what, actually, frankly, the timing of this webinar was we wanted to wait until Treasury had more guidance on some of the direct pay provisions. So that is coming out, and you just need to pay attention with your either consultant or like the people you might work with who might be more day-to-day in these things to get that clarification.
I'll just, if I could just weigh in very briefly, I'll just say that I think it is a challenging sort of landscape insofar as, like, nonprofits like Ian and I work for, we're only willing to go so far in terms of providing guidance. We certainly don't want to be providing legal advice. I am an attorney by background, but it's not the place. So no one wants to sort of provide the case specific legal guidance. And the IRS is the same way, where they issue private letter rulings that are very sort of fact bound and specific to individual taxpayers. They do issue some broader guidance, but it is challenging. And I do think that a lot of this stuff necessarily involves finding a tax advisor.
Yeah. So there was one question about someone mentioned a private HBCU. This idea that you're a private or a public institution in the IRA, there's not a whole lot of distinction from that category, right? It's more like, are you a 501c3 nonprofit or an instrumentality of the state? Those are the bigger buckets.
That's absolutely
who's eligible.
Correct. So I think I feel comfortable saying this, that a university as a 501c3 nonprofit is by statute allowable for elective pay. It's not necessarily like the private public distinction in higher ed between, that doesn't really matter.
Right.
Yeah.
Not all higher ed is 501c3 nonprofits, but the ones that are not, or on this instrumentality of the state side. Yeah. We didn't touch on prevailing wage apprenticeships and domestic content requirements all that explicitly. And I wondered, maybe Ian or even Francine, like, have you seen how those requirements that already do exist in a lot of locations, prevailing wage, if you're a unionized, if you're in a labor environment, organized labor environment, will that be difficult to navigate under the IRA? Is there additional forms you need to fill out and demonstrate how you're addressing those requirements? Or is that in the add-on category? Ian, I think you mentioned, what was it, base and bonus or something?
Well, those are bonuses, right, Ian?
Bonus, yeah.
Yeah, but the prevailing, I think calling out the prevailing wage and apprenticeship one is really important, because the way that one works is that if you don't have it, so for example, the ITC base for most projects is going to be 30% of your investment. If you don't meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, it's going to be 6%. It's reduced by 80% if you don't meet those. So it's effectively a requirement if you want to make it useful. There is guidance out there about the prevailing wage and apprenticeship and what that means. Prevailing wage is a specific term that is defined by Department of Labor. They have tables and explanations of all this. Frankly, what we are probably going to see, as this happens, is that we're going to be relying on developers, on the people who you are contracting with to make sure that they're filling these requirements. I think it's, I think people recognize that it's unreasonable for the tax paying entities themselves, or the ones filing, to be the ones on the ground doing this. So I think there's going to be a lot of reliance on developers and on them certifying and just making sure that everything's good from their end.
Yeah, and I'll just, if I may, I'll just say too, I know there's some challenges around domestic content, and one way to sort of fulfill that requirement is just to keep projects under 1 megawatt. That's one sort of workaround. There's other exceptions too that you could proceed, but I know there have been some concerns leveled about how onerous those requirements are, but keeping projects at a smaller scale does do the trick.
And I would say this is where advocacy comes in. So if people are having those problems communicating with your people like me, your government affairs or communications or legal team, can really help us to convey that, because it is, while this is not a bill that people want to touch right now, it is the kind of thing that over time there may be opportunities legislatively or regulatorily to address some of these things if it becomes essential. And so that's the government affairs answer to that question. If it's really unworkable, we want to know that so we can see if we can change it.
That's a great point. Yep. And you can, that's the thing. There is mechanisms. It may be hard to do. It may be politically difficult at a given time, but it's possible. Before we move in, I want to end on some technology questions and then wrap it up with some additional resources. But Francine, you mentioned kind of the tax credit process on your 1099. There was a question: have any tax credits been paid out? If not, when do we expect to see the elective payments dispersed? So this is all. You go ahead.
Yeah, so the timing is really clear. If you visit the IRS website, you have to file that pre-registration form, which will be out this fall. If you're planning to file with this year's tax year, you will not get the credit. The IRS is not required to give you the credit until your tax bill is due, whenever that is. For nonprofits, it's not quite the same as for individuals. So your institution will know what your calendar is for filing, and that is when they're required to give you what you deserve. But again, that form is not even out yet, so you couldn't have filed yet. It is not possible for anyone to have gotten a refund yet. Sometime next year will be the first refunds.
Great. Okay, a few I didn't even notice. We have a special bonus prize for you audience members. Dennis Carlberg from BU. Hey, Dennis, you have your hand up.
Thanks, Tim. And thanks everyone for a great panel. I just wanted to get a word in edgewise before we had a wrap up on this. I just want to float the idea that the Green Ribbon Commission and Second Nature, the Higher Ed Working Group, at least with the Green Ribbon Commission and Second Nature, partner to really build a knowledge exchange, a network. When we were exploring renewable energy in the early days, back in 2015, we formed a renewable energy purchasing network, which was very helpful in leveraging everybody's climbing the learning curve. And I feel like this is really a great opportunity or a great need for us all to work together on helping us all kind of move. If I may, Azanta, ask people to reach out to you if they're interested, I think that would be a great opportunity. And I'll leave it at that. And Tim, you can get back to it and I'll be
awesome.
quiet.
No,
Thanks.
Great idea, Dennis, and thank you. I saw at least 2 floating hands coming up out of the ether. That means something. Someone's clapping somewhere. 2 quick technology questions. Let people love them some geothermal. So questions around where does geothermal energy get placed in the tax credits? And if a campus is looking to do multiple wells, do you think there might be a good place to look for funding? Can you just speak to geothermal, maybe, Ian?
Yeah, I can do that. So geothermal, so right now under the current rules, geothermal energy is eligible for both the ITC and PTC, but starting in 2025, the credits become technology neutral, meaning any net zero clean energy source can receive the credits. And so what we're probably going to see is for individual energy projects, folks are going to have to choose between the ITC or PTC. There are advantages to both depending on your scenario, and that's really a question of your developer or you doing the calculations to figure out which one is going to be the most cost effective. So the answer is yes, both geothermal energy is available for both. Interestingly enough, geothermal heat pumps, I can't comment exactly on the individual scenario that somebody posed, but geothermal heat pumps are actually eligible for ITC credits through 2033. So only geothermal heat pumps, though. I don't know if a test well or something. I don't know what exactly. It would probably have to be a placed in service requirement. But that option is available. So yeah, there are supports for geothermal within the tax credit regime.
Yeah, the only thing I might add too, Ian, that was great, is just that for generally, you can pick the ITC or PTC for some of these projects. Generally, for smaller projects, the ITC is going to be better. It's only when you get to sort of really large scale projects that the PCT is going to be preferable, and that's you're going to have to file year after year. So there's some sort of more administrative burdens too as well.
All right, in the last minute, I was hoping we could just show WRI, you had that resources slide. And is it possible to get that back up, Azanta?
Yeah, let me just share my screen super quickly. Great, perfect.
Yeah, and if you can just shoot on back to their slide, that would be great. Because I think in the right now time, this is a good place for you to have a variety of resources with links to where you can go. Dennis's idea of creating a knowledge exchange / community of practice for people who are interested in continuing this conversation and learning from each other, I think is something we definitely would be interested in helping with. And as a follow-up to this webinar, we can reach out to the attendees and people who were able to participate, and people who just registered and may want to participate in something like that for the future. But we'll send this out. I think we've mentioned a number of times, we'll share these slides with you. And I imagine these links will be live in those slides, Nate. And I think your tool, did you want to speak at all to that tool that just mention one more time, end of the month, the path, the mapper? Is that first one?
Yeah, so we're going to produce a written document that I think will have really valuable guidance and some associated materials with that. We also do have a mapping tool where you can go down to sort of the census tract level and see what you might be eligible for in terms of bonus credits and Justice 40 initiative eligibility. Next Tuesday, we have a webinar that I think would be really valuable that's going to cover some of the same ground, but also some other ground. And there's also some tools that you can sort of toggle with to see what kind of federal funding opportunities you might be eligible for. I know a lot of these are focused towards local governments, but I think they apply to nonprofit entities at large. And we already talked about the local infrastructure hub, but please reach out to I'm sure any of the panelists, any of us, if you have specific questions or follow-on questions. Thanks.
And if I can give a shout out, Tim, to your document from last year, it's still something I refer to help keep the program straight. So if folks haven't seen that, they should take a look.
Yeah, we stuck it in the chat there. All right, I think I'm done. Azanta, any words that you wanted to say? We really appreciate everyone attending.
Well, I think that was great. Thank you all so much for attending. I think people are dropping off to attend their 2 p.m. So I will be sending out the recording with the transcript and links, and anything else, please let me know if you have any questions about. And you can find this on our website later. Thank you all so much for your time and have a great day. Bye,
Thanks.
everyone.